So much of the way in which we understand today's world comes down to the stories we tell each other about it, and I include in that journalism and the stories we tell here. Every narrative we tell is built upon foundations made up of who's telling the story and how and why they choose to tell it. More than once on this podcast, we've spoken to journalists about what they can do, if anything, when the timeline of a story gets dragged out and how it can affect the narrative. Because ultimately, how timely a story is, how newsy and how relevant is one of the most important pillars on which to build a narrative. And it's one of the most important ways that readers understand a story's importance. And so if it starts to drag on and people lose attention, they're not going to listen, and a story fades away if it has no audience. If it sounds as if I'm talking about Gaza, I'm not. If it sounds as if I'm talking about Sudan, I'm not. Nor the Democratic Republic of the Congo, nor Ukraine, nor any of the dozens of conflicts around the world that have raged for weeks and months. I'm talking about all of them. And when it comes to reporting these conflicts, sometimes the sheer scale of them is the problem. Stories that get too big and drag in multiple different countries, like Israel's war on Gaza and its neighbors, or those that have multiple narratives, none of which are easily understood, like Sudan, and those that go on for months and years without much change, like Ukraine, are particularly difficult to keep reporting and to keep track of. Small wonder then that sometimes journalists turn to fiction. Last year, I asked the journalist Yaroslav Trofimov, the Wall Street Journal's chief foreign affairs correspondent, to come on the podcast to discuss why, after decades of reporting, he had most recently chosen to tell the story of his birthplace Ukraine through the medium of a novel. The purpose of his novel, No Country for Love, was to use fictionalized characters drawn from real historical figures, including from Yaroslav's own family, to show the events that shaped the psychology of the nation, as he wrote. A fiction that way told becomes an easier way to understand private lives and how they change in these very public wars. Last month, we invited Yaroslav to one of our live events at the Frontline Club in London to continue some of these discussions about storytelling. Alongside Yaroslav, we invited the journalist Christina, the Sunday Times' chief foreign correspondent. My colleague Lydia Wilson asked her how important it is to return to a story on multiple occasions, in Christina's case, Afghanistan. And curiously, she ended up echoing the thoughts of one of our recent podcast interviewees, Lise Doucette, another student of Afghanistan, by noting that she's made so many important relationships in the year she's been covering the Afghan story, and that really drives her motivation to keep telling it. We wanted to share with you some of that conversation from the live event. It's a dynamic discussion, and one that I hope helps us to understand how we tell stories a little bit better. I'm Faisal Yafai. Here's this week's episode of The Lead.
So I wanted actually to start at a slight angle and ask a journalism question rather than a world question. And you have covered so many wars between you. And I wonder, what's it like when you're telling a story that you're deeply familiar with? Do you every single time stop and think, how much does my audience in America or the UK already know? Do you have to go back and cover the background again and again and again? How do you handle that kind of balance?
I don't actually think about that when I'm writing. I think it's great if you do really know a story and you're well informed. I think sometimes the place I've spent more time than anywhere is Afghanistan. I started out there back in 1988 when the Russians or the then Soviet Union was occupying Afghanistan, and I've gone back and forth ever since. So I think that I have a very good understanding of Afghanistan. But it's very interesting because every so often I'll read a piece by somebody who's gone there, who's never been there, and thought, wow, actually that's really interesting. And it's something I knew about, but had kind of took for granted because I'd gone there so many times. And so I think there is always actually a benefit of a fresh eye on a place.
Well, it's just exactly what Lise Doucette, that you interviewed here on this very stage last week, and she was on the podcast with Faisal. It's a wonderful conversation, anyone who hasn't heard it, the New Lines magazine podcast, The Lead. And she said pretty much exactly that. I think she even used the word fresh eyes, didn't she?
Yeah,
I know.
And
well,
she
I
said,
promise I hadn't listened.
no, I think she said it while she was here as well.
the benefit, the huge benefit she was saying of having people who are not experts, or they're going to a country for the first time and they're asking questions that to her seem quite obvious, but they're questions that maybe people need the answer to. And if you are very experienced in a place, you quite often don't think to ask those ones because you know the answer already. So you don't think to ask your sources. I don't know, does that resonate for you, Yaro?
I mean, in a way, so I have a slightly different perspective because I ended up covering a war in my own country after covering other people's wars for 20-something years. But it's also, a country from which I hadn't actually reported that much. I hadn't been reporting from Ukraine during the first round of the invasion in 2014 and 15. So, in a way, when I went back in January 2022, ahead of the full-scale invasion and stayed there for most of that year and the following year, I had the benefit of fresh eyes journalistically because, I hadn't been writing millions of articles about this. But on the other hand, I did have the very deep familiarity with the place, the language and the culture, languages. And I guess that was also an asset. And I felt that because I do have this familiarity, I have an extra responsibility to push harder, to take more risks, and to go and tell the story because I felt I was able to capture the nuance that often would not be captured. And, and I did take much bigger risks there than, say, in Afghanistan or in Iraq.
You did? You felt
definitely.
Really?
Yeah.
And because you felt this kind of responsibility to the...
Well, again, it's the country where I was born, so I felt a sense of personal insult at, my hometown being bombarded and having to wear the flak jackets on the street where I grew up. But on the other hand, because I understood how it works, I could find a way to get to places many other people could not get to, and then get the finest meanings and finest sort of shades of meaning in what people were saying or not saying. I think it was a sense of mission, definitely.
Still, perhaps, I think, because we're still in the middle of it.
Well, yeah. I mean, luckily for me, I managed to not get hit, unlike some other colleagues, but. Just on the personal and emotional level, I felt that the risks were worth taking there in a way that they weren't, for me personally, in other conflicts. This
aspect of the emotion and the personality, the personal, I think is really interesting. And for you, Christina, and also for Lise Doucette, who was in Afghanistan, neither of you are from Afghanistan, but both of you feel that, it's kind of like a home for Lise. And for you as well. You went there extremely early in your career.
Yeah, I don't know what it is about Afghanistan, but it somehow attracts, I think, particularly what you also spent a lot of time there, but there do seem to be a number of female reporters that have become very passionate about Afghanistan. And I never set out to, my story, I went there by accident. I basically never set out to cover war and conflict. And I ended up there because of a wedding. And I had been invited to a wedding in Pakistan, which I'd never been to, and it wasn't an ordinary wedding. It was the wedding of Benazir Bhutto, and she at that time was opposition leader. She'd been living here in exile. So what happened was I was interning at the Financial Times. I went to a lunch that the foreign editor was supposed to go to and couldn't go last minute, and it was for South Asian politicians. And they were expecting the foreign editor of the Financial Times, most important newspaper, and they got the intern, but they were very nice about it. And I sat next to somebody who was the Secretary General of the Pakistan People's Party, the opposition party, and well, at that point, Pakistan was under military dictatorship, so they were actually forbidden party. And this man asked me if I'd like to interview Benazir Bhutto, who was at that point living here in exile. And of course I said yes. So I went to interview her, and the day I went to interview her was the day she'd announced her engagement to Asif Ali Zardari. So her flat was absolutely full of bouquets of flowers. I had never seen so many. And I did the interview. She then went back to Pakistan I got a job working for something called Central TV in Birmingham as a trainee reporter. And one day I came home from work and there was this gold inscribed invitation on my doormat, and it was to Benazir's wedding in Karachi. So of course I said yes. And to this day, I don't really know why she invited somebody who she'd basically just met once, who came to interview her, to her wedding as not as a journalist, but as a friend, really. And I went to all the sort of family and friend ceremonies and gatherings.
With those things,
that
Christine,
changed my life. And
with those things, I guess where I was going with the idea of fresh eyes is that, you've had this connection to Afghanistan for a long time, and some of the people involved, I mean, Benazir Bhutto is no longer with us. It must feel sometimes when you're writing about that country that you almost know so much history that it is hard to convey it to a new audience. And so
I don't know about that. I mean, what it feels is it's more than a story to me. When I'm writing about what's happening there, I think about the people that I know there, and it's not my country in the way that Ukraine is for Yarrow, but I think about all these people that I've known for years, and so I really, really want people outside to understand what's happening and to care. And actually, goodness, it's early in the evening to say this, but, I feel very angry that here we are 4 years after the Taliban have taken over. This is the only country in the world where girls can't go to school, women can't work, can't go to the park, to gyms, to hair salons. Even books written by women have now been banned. And who's talking about it, right? I mean, it's like the world has just moved on. I feel ashamed as a woman, as a journalist, as a mother, that this is a situation. And it just seems very odd to me that we're not discussing this more. So any possible opportunity, I talk about it, and I try and get stories about Afghanistan in the Sunday Times as much as possible, which is not easy because as a Western woman, I can't get a visa to go there.
Well, I do wonder, with both of you having such a deep familiarity in a different way, of course, is there a sort of weight of stories that you're carrying? How do you even begin to choose what to report on? You must be hearing things all the time when you're on the streets. Obviously not now, Christina, but when you have been in Afghanistan. How do you both select the human stories that tell what you want to convey?
I mean, Afghanistan is a country of stories. That's what attracted me to it in the first place. But and the country of storytellers, people are very good at telling stories. But I don't know that it's so difficult. I mean, you want to tell. I'm always looking for people that I can tell stories through, and often, I mean, I was just in Syria, right? That's very complicated. I was in Sweden, where the Druze and the local Bedouin are fighting, but also people from all over the country had come to fight there, from Idlib and other places. It's really difficult explaining to people who have never been and probably maybe don't care very much, like what's going on. So you're trying to find a story that really grabs people. I came across a lot of really horrific stories there, but there was one particular story. There was a family who, when the fighting started, were trying to get their 3 sons and 3 nephews to safety. And so they started driving out of the Sweden town into the hills where they'd been told it was safer. And were stopped at a checkpoint. And so the parents were in one car, the boys were in the other car, and they were stopped by people who were basically from some of the extremist groups that had moved in to attack the Druze. These people were Druze. And the parents were made to sit in their car and watch the 3 sons and nephews be massacred in front of them. Can you imagine doing, how that must be? It was a horrific story. But that, to me, immediately, this is something almost sort of, it's so chilling, but also sort of cinematic, almost, what had happened. So, you're, trying to find something that really will make people sit up and care, hopefully.
Yeah. I think very often in Ukraine or in Afghanistan, the issue is you have too many stories, right? You have to choose, and people really do want to talk. I mean, for me, kind of really eye-opening experience was covering the parts of Ukraine that were liberated in September 2022. Yeah. So you've come to all these villages and towns where people lived under very brutal occupation for 7 months. And 7 months they couldn't talk. 7 months they were afraid of saying the wrong word because it would mean execution probably. Yeah. And then when suddenly you start asking them questions, they're very reticent for the first 2 or 3 minutes. And then it's like a psychotherapy session because they would talk for 2 or 3 hours and tell you everything. And I remember after a day in this town called Shevchenko, I sort of walked out with, so many notes. I could write a whole book just on that village. And I guess when you are covering these conflicts, I think to me, a very sort of important thread line through this was I'm trying to de-exoticize whatever is happening. Yeah. Because I think it's very important. Because people get caught up, all these Afghans, they wear fatty turbans and burqas that must be different from us fundamentally or whatever. Yeah. But as trying to convey all these points that link their experiences to the lives of our readers, kind of show that people we write about, they may be far away, not that far away in case of Ukraine, but they really all have the same hopes and aspirations and desires that pretty much everybody else in this room.
It's tricky, right? Because we've talked about this. We've had a lot of foreign correspondents on the stage, and it's tricky, right? Because on the one hand, you want to be able to, as you say, de-exoticize it. On the other hand, I think sometimes the audience, beyond these walls, the audience needs a kind of avatar. So this is what Clarissa Ward said on the stage, that sometimes you need somebody that the audience can kind of see the war through the conflict through. I wonder if you feel that that is something that is maybe less important these days, or does it still really matter that there isn't this avatar for the audience?
Well, I think it's probably less important if you have space in an article as opposed to a 3-minute TV show, right? TV story. But yeah, I mean, there's a problem of avatars. When you say Ukraine to people imagine Zelensky. Yeah, because it's probably the only Ukrainian they're aware of. Yeah. And you do really have to explain in articles by showing real people doing real things that the war is not about Zelensky. Zelensky's come and go and Ukraine stays. I thought, before we get to the novel,
Christina, perhaps you could tell us about the children that have been kidnapped, because I know you've written about this in Ukraine, about the children who have been taken into Russia. I thought that was very moving, because it's the kind of part of the story that a lot of people can really understand that. When you say something like, people's kids have been kidnapped from orphanages and they're taken into Russia and indoctrinated, and that is very powerful. A lot of people can really relate to that because they have kids of their own. Is that something that, obviously it must have affected you very deeply, but is it something that you found that the readers resonate with, that they can really grasp that aspect of it, even if perhaps some of the other stories about Ukraine seem very exotic?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, to me, that was one of the most chilling stories that I've ever worked on. The idea of, your children going to school and being sent to a summer camp. So that was the first time that I wrote about it, that I met these people whose kids, so they were in occupied areas, and they were told that they would be sent to like a football camp or a summer camp, and it would be good for them, and they'd go for 1 or 2 weeks. So like huge numbers went in these buses to Crimea, and then they never came back. And then the parents were going to the school and saying, like, where's our kids? What's happened? And then we're like, oh no, don't worry, they just moved to another camp. And then, weeks became months and they didn't come back. And they'd basically been abducted. And
some of these kids are very young.
Yeah.
So sometimes, of course, we've all read the stories, but sometimes when they eventually get brought back to Ukraine or they get to family, they've forgotten the parents. Because they're so young. It's been a couple of years.
Some of them were taken from orphanages and were very young and maybe will never come back, I would say, because, we don't know how many kids have been taken. There's this number of 20,000, but that's where people have actually reported. But a lot of them may have been taken from orphanages and not had anyone report, or their parents were killed, and so the number's probably a lot higher. And that was an interesting story because I reported on that in a big way, and a lot of people knew about that story but were not really reporting on it. And so I found it very odd. To me, there was nothing more chilling or shocking going on really than that. So I spent quite a lot of time working on that at the beginning, and people were shocked when I wrote that story. But actually, at that point, most people covering Ukraine, I think, knew about it but hadn't been reporting on it. It was strange. It's sometimes this whole thing of, there was a lot else going on. And it's also, going back to your original question about how you decide what to write about, early on in conflicts, like the start of the full-scale invasion, we could write about anything about Ukraine and it would get in the paper. But people wanted to know everything. Like we could write about the zoos, about the parks, about people looking at cherry blossom. And people would read it because, now we can measure what people read. Yeah. But that's changed now, that war has been going on for quite some time, and you have to have a new angle or something different to be able to really get people to care and write.
Well, this leads very interestingly to the kind of a meta question about how you tell a story. But I think before we do the meta question, we have to do the novel.
We do. Well, because it leads so clearly on from what you've already said, and this weight of information that people were sharing with you, like you were the therapist. Is that one reason you think you went into novel writing after a career in journalism?
Well, yes and no. I think I got the idea of writing a novel when I was writing a previous book, which was about the Siege of Mecca, it's a narrative nonfiction book, but it's a book based on real facts. And I remember as I was writing it, you have this realization that, okay, you're like a searchlight, what happened here, what happened here, what happened here, but you have no idea what happened in all these dark spaces. And you cannot infer or imagine it because it's a nonfiction book. Yeah. But your narrative would be so much better if you could fill these gaps. Right. And so the idea of writing this novel, which is based on the real life of my real grandmother, who was really called Deborah, came to me actually in 2014. And I was living in Kabul. We were all very preoccupied with the outcome of Afghan elections, as the fate of the Afghan democracy seemed very important in Washington at the time. So I wasn't allowed to go to Ukraine and cover that invasion. And I was flabbergasted by just how misunderstood Ukraine was, even though it's a European country, even though it's very close to our readers in Europe. It was really a terra incognita because everything that most people knew about Ukraine, including people who didn't really like Putin, was what they learned through Russian eyes. Ukraine having been a Russian colony meant that, anybody who knew anything about it knew it through Russian studies or through...
Including Ukrainians in the diaspora to some degree.
Well, no Ukrainians in the diaspora. Ukrainians in the diaspora have kept the tradition of scholarship going, but it was very much on the margins of public knowledge. And I saw this lies about Ukraine of the Russian propaganda being repeated by people who are kind of well-meaning but just didn't know. Right. And I felt that I needed to write about Ukrainian history, which is very complex and contradictory, but it's not a history that the Russian state wants to portray. And in the Russian official narrative, every Ukrainian who doesn't want to be a Russian is a Nazi. Pretty much. This is the definition of Nazi in current Russian sort of government speak. And but I want to write this book for people who do not read history books. necessarily, but people who do not necessarily write nonfiction books. And I want to tell it through a story, which in itself is a fascinating story of, again, my grandmother, who as a young woman came to the capital of Ukraine at the time, Kharkiv, with its skyscrapers and a cultural boom and the Renaissance, which then came to be known as the Executed Renaissance, and then lived through some of the deadliest decades of the 20th century anywhere in the world, because if you look at the numbers, Ukraine had 28 million people at the end of the 1920s. 4 million were killed at least in the artificial famine in 1930-31. Hundreds of thousands were executed in the following years, and then about 10 million died in World War II. Between the Holocaust, the Ukrainians who fought in the ranks of the Soviet army, and civilians who perished from both totalitarian states, really.
And that's where you start, isn't it? 1930.
Right. So the span of the book is 1930 to 1953, which is a defining period of Ukrainian history. And I'll just give you the statistics of how unlikely it was to survive that. And so everyone in Ukraine today is a descendant of people who managed to survive this mid-grandeur of history. And a period to go through which required making a lot of compromises, because you cannot, with a few exceptions, you cannot emerge pure and uncorrupted through all this mayhem. And so the book examines the cost of survival and all the choices that Deborah had to make to save herself, to save the people she loved, what she did for love, and the tragedies of that. And I think it's really relevant for the war today, because I finished writing the first draft just before the full-scale invasion in 2021. And it describes all the scenes of bombing of Kiev. And then literally, a month later, I was in Kiev watching Kiev being bombed. And for real, which actually felt kind of very similar to what I was describing.
I think that's partly why I think it's a nice novel, and why you're reading it. When I was reading it, last year, we were reading it at a point when a lot of the things that you talk about are actually real. They're not history anymore. They're really happening.
Well, that's the crux of the matter, I think, in Ukraine today, because it's really impossible to understand why Ukrainians, almost 4 years into the full-scale war, are still resisting, are still fighting back, are refusing to surrender despite destruction of cities, horrendous casualties, and we don't know exactly how many, but hundreds of thousands lost their lives, or they at least were maimed. And the reason for this is that everyone in Ukraine has a grandmother, grandfather, great-grandfather like this, and this historical memory of the domination by Moscow is making people realize that no matter how hard it is now, the alternative of surrender is worse, because surrender will bring more death, more destruction, will be returned to this dark past, which the Russian state is not hiding. It's really telling that one of the first things that the Russian military does when they conquer a Ukrainian village or a town is they bulldoze the monument to the victims of the famine, because they claim it never happened. It's an invention of Ukrainian nationalists. And kind of the Ukrainians are driven by the spirit of never again, and the Russians by the spirit of who can repeat.
That was Yaroslav Trofimov and Christina Lamb at our event in London last month. You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. This week's episode was produced by Finbar and hosted by me, Faisal Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app, or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.